see that?
Yeah.
Awesome. So, hello everyone. I'm an engineering co-op student, and I've been working with Wishart Labs since September. I work on the 4th floor, directly under Scott, and I've been working for the last 7.5 months on automating the NIH project. Most of my work has been focused on developing and designing an economical autopipetting, pumping, and resin-based metabolite capture filtration system. And testing the implementation of the diacetylspermine, hippuric acid, creatinine, and glutamate assays on these systems. And I spend most of my time on the 4th floor designing, 3D printing, programming, and wiring things. And we built pretty much an entire automated system that can do all of the assays related to the NIH project in the last 7 months or so. I was looking at the robot. I was going to point the camera at it, but I don't think that would be as effective as showing you pictures. So this is pretty much the completed thing that I've designed. These were all taken about a month ago. The robot hasn't undergone any major structural changes since then, just testing. We designed peristaltic pumps. They're all accurate to within about 2% of each other, and they're accurate, self-consistent to within 1%. I designed an autopipetting system that you can see here as well. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this system is capable of autopipetting up to 20 different things. Well, about 20 different things. And then sensing the colorimetric reactions that we get after the assays are run. We can pump in various things through this nozzle. And we start with various enzymes, reaction mixes, and dyes loaded into the tray. We've already completed testing with we haven't completed testing with all 4 assays. We've completed testing with 1, and the other 3 are in testing and pending. We have a little bit more to do, but that's looking pretty good. And we also came up with, you can't see it super well from this angle, diacetylspermine filtration and metabolite concentration system that lets us increase the concentration of a metabolite, in this case diacetylspermine, so that we can do colorimetric reactions with metabolites that are present in very low concentrations. We also wired up this brain to control everything, and this is another closer image of the resin column filtration system. And my talk today will be on a brief history of spaceflight. I realize this is a very broad subject, but there's been some very interesting advancements recently. So I'd like to discuss the history and what the significance of those recent advancements are. If you're going to talk about spaceflight, you kind of have to start with astronomy, I think. That seems to me to be the natural precursor to spaceflight. The first recorded astronomical observations were made 3 millennia ago in ancient Mesopotamia, which is around Egypt, not quite Egypt, but in the Middle East. The Greeks and the Romans, the Chinese and the Indians all made astronomical observations. When the Greeks and Romans fell during the Middle Ages, Islamic scholars continued to translate their work in the Middle East and continued to build upon that. In 1608, a Dutch optometrist created the very first telescope and filed a patent for it. The next year, Galileo began working with the same design, and we continued to improve on that. And then Kepler added lenses, Newton added mirrors, telescopes progressively became more powerful, more clever, more sophisticated, much larger, and development has continued to the present day and into space with the development of the James Webb Space Telescope, the Hubble Space Telescope, modern very large telescopes, including one telescope, which I believe is called the Very Large Telescope. All of the inner planets, as well as Jupiter and Saturn, were known before telescopes were invented. One of my little pieces of trivia is that the old English word for these bodies was wander star, because they thought they were the same sort of objects as stars, because we didn't know what stars were back around 1000 AD. The French word planet has since replaced it. It's one of the Norman words that has since wandered into English. But I find that very interesting that they used to call them wander stars. Typically, the brightest stars in the night sky aren't actually stars, they're planets. Uranus was then discovered in near the end of the 17th, or sorry, the 18th century by William Herschel using a telescope, and this was the first planet to be discovered in this way. And in the same year, Charles Messier discovered Messier 87, which is a very large galaxy, which has a black hole at the center that we've taken a picture of. Charles Messier discovered this while creating his catalog of interstellar objects, which he thought were all nebulae, which it turns out that they weren't. About 20 of them are galaxies, but his catalog is very interesting nonetheless. Of course, after we spent a great deal of time looking at space, we kind of asked the question, how could we explore it? And the first practical paper detailing a method by which we might be able to explore space was published in 1919 by Robert Goddard. It's called, I forget what it was called, a method for propulsion, I forget. This paper was read, though, by Fritz van Opel and Max Valier, a pair of Germans, and they began developing rockets, putting them on cars and trains and planes, and setting land speed records. They did this from 1920 to 1935, when their work was shut down by the Nazis who took over power in Germany. Rocketry research continued in Germany into the Second World War, but was led by Werner von Braun, who was also inspired by Goddard's paper. He led the German efforts to develop a long-range ballistic missile called the V2 rocket. These were deployed near the end of the war. They were first used on September 6, 1944, against recently liberated Paris. This was after the Battle of Stalingrad, so the Eastern Front was collapsing. And this was after the Allies had begun their push back into Germany, because they'd recently liberated Paris. So this was right at the tail end of the war, right when it was becoming obvious that Germany was losing, that they were deploying these weapons. And they weren't used near the beginning. Both the Americans and the Soviets captured the rocket, and von Braun's team, along with a number of other Nazi scientists, were captured and subsequently employed by the Americans. This was known as Operation Paperclip, and it was intended to give the Americans a strategic advantage over the Soviets, who were also recovering a lot of the German technology. In June 1944, during the Second World War, a V2 rocket was launched more than 100 meters, or gained an altitude of more than 100 kilometers, which is known as the Kármán line, and this was the first man-made object to reach space. After the end of the Second World War, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons began, the United States and the Soviet Union began the space race. Many of us, I think, have heard of this. It was difficult at this time to engage in combat with each other directly, because each side had nuclear weapons, which could be used to just destroy the world. So instead of competing militarily, they competed technologically. And this is a picture of Laika, the first living being launched into space, launched in 1957 by the Soviets. The first Soviet rockets were the R7 family, which were all derived from the V2 rocket, from the captured rockets they had obtained from the Germans. The Soyuz, which operates to this day, was then based on the R7 design, and the Soyuz, until recently, was the only way we had of delivering astronauts to the space station. This design is somewhat interesting, I think, because it features 4 symmetrical rocket boosters which fall away during flight. This launched the very first Soviet missions into orbit, Sputnik 1 and 2, on October 4 and November 3rd, 1957, just a month apart. The Americans responded to the Soviet launches with their own rocket and satellite. These satellites were developed by von Braun and his team of German scientists, and they delivered the Explorer satellites to orbit. Explorer 1, which was the first American satellite in orbit, launched just 3 months after Sputnik 1. And both Explorer 1 and Sputnik 1 did very little other than beep and record micrometeorite impacts. They were more a display of, if this satellite was actually a bomb, look what our country would be able to do to you. And they were less focused on the science and more on the military sort of aspect. Yuri Gagarin soon thereafter became the first cosmonaut, first Russian to reach space. Just 3 years after Sputnik and Explorer launched, the Russians launched the first human. This established the Soviet lead in the space race. But then Alan Shepard, the first American, followed less than a month later on May 5th, 1961. There was only about 3 or 4 years between the first launch, or the first orbital American launch, and them putting their first astronaut in space. Things were proceeding very quickly, much more so than we tend to develop rockets today. Both nations would continue to launch spacefarers over the coming years as part of the Vostok, Mercury, and Gemini programs. Then the Americans started to take over and sort of edge out the Soviets once they were in space. On Gemini 8, they performed the first docking maneuver with a craft that had already been launched. And the first extended duration orbital flights were also made as part of the Gemini program. We then had a race to the moon. The Americans developed the Apollo program with the aim of landing on the moon before 1970. They did succeed in this. The Apollo program only lasted for 3 years, though, which I found rather interesting when I was doing my research. We did launch 6 Apollo missions, which were mostly successful, other than the 13th. But there was only a 3-year period in which we were actively putting people on the moon. The Soviet moon effort involved this beast of a rocket, the N-1, which did not finish development and was canceled in 1976. The N-1 attempted 4 different launches, all of which failed for various reasons. After that, though, we stopped sort of making firsts. After Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, we stopped sort of competing. The Americans launched Skylab in 1973, just 4 years after the first, 4 years after Apollo 11, on the last flight of the Saturn V. And the Soviets would launch several smaller Salyut space stations, 2 of which were used for reconnaissance. The Soviets would also develop the modular space station Mir, which operated for 14 years and outlasted the Soviet Union. And then, of course, we would go on to develop the ISS. And the Americans developed and retired the shuttle program, which was a lighter lift program. And of course, we built the ISS. A lot of this sort of peeling back of efforts towards space is because spaceflight up until now and to now has been obscenely expensive. A Saturn V launch cost more than $1 billion in today's money, and that delivered and each of those was capable of delivering 140 metric tons to low Earth orbit, which is what was required to deliver a lander to the moon. If you work that out, that's about $7,000 per kilogram of mass to low Earth orbit. And a lot of that mass, if you want to get anywhere from low Earth orbit, has to be fuel. The shuttle was even more expensive if you work it out. It's close to $20,000 per kilogram to low Earth orbit. Neither craft is capable of supporting long-term, large-scale human habitation beyond low Earth orbit, which makes it very difficult for us to establish a permanent moon base or a permanent base out beyond the orbit of the moon or on Mars or beyond. So recently, we've seen this in the news over the last few years. Several private rocket companies have started exploring the possibility of reusable rockets. SpaceX had a number of firsts in this category, although it's still quite expensive. It's $50 million a launch for 20 tons to low Earth orbit. Still $2,500 per kilogram, which is cheaper than the space shuttle almost by a factor of 10, but still not capable of supporting like an extended moon base or a long duration moon base or a long duration colony on another planet. Electron, which is a New Zealand company, also, or sorry, not Electron. Electron is the rocket. I forget what the company is called. Also have a reusable rocket in development, as does Blue Origin, but neither has flown a reusable orbital class rocket just yet. Blue Origin does have a reusable suborbital rocket called the New Glenn, and they're also developing a reusable orbital class rocket called the New Shepard. And Rocket Lab is regularly launching their single-use orbital class rocket known as the Electron, and they're developing a direct competitor for the Falcon 9, which will be known as the Neutron. SpaceX, though, is currently designing a super heavy lift vehicle called Starship, which is intended to make human missions to the moon or Mars economically viable. I've been following Starship since about junior high, so for the last, that's a while. And it's intended to be fully reusable and deliver 150 tons to low Earth orbit. This will be more than the Saturn V, more than the Space Launch System, which was recently developed by NASA, and more than any other rocket ever conceived by anyone. NASA has also recently developed the Space Launch System, which was intended to return humans to the moon. And they recently completed a proof of concept flight, which I found very exciting. Also not very cost effective. NASA doesn't release official cost estimates for this program, but it's expected to cost about $10,000 per kilogram to low Earth orbit. However, it is intended as a moon rocket, and it will be used as such in the coming years. China is also developing a reusable super heavy rocket, but they haven't posted a lot of information about that. It's known as the Long March 9. The Artemis program, which was recently announced by NASA, will use the space launch system, or not recently announced, I suppose. It's been in development for years, but they recently announced the crew who will be the first to orbit the moon since Apollo. Will use the SLS to orbit and eventually land on the moon. The launch will occur late next year, hopefully November. It will likely get delayed as space tends, as these things tends to happen to these things. But what I find interesting about the Artemis 1 crew is the man on the right, Jeremy Hansen, who will be the first Canadian to orbit the moon. Additionally, on this flight, we'll have the first woman to orbit the moon and the first person of color to orbit the moon. NASA's interested in sort of setting these firsts, which is very good. Now, what I think is very interesting or very exciting is the first Starship test flight occurred just yesterday morning. SpaceX's super heavy rocket lifted off the launch pad at about 7:30 in the morning. It exploded 4 minutes into the flight after spinning out of control, but it was so exciting. If you can find time in your day to Google that launch, or you'll probably see it on the news, I definitely encourage you to do that. We don't have a cost estimate for like what this rocket will be capable of in terms of delivering material to orbit, or like the cost per launch. But SpaceX is intending eventually to land this rocket right back on the pad, fuel it back up, and launch it again. Fuel should only cost about, it should be under $1 million for fuel. And if they can get maintenance down, then they could be looking at costs per launch of potentially under 10 million or under $1 million for a single launch, which could put the price, like the material, the mass to low Earth orbit at something around like $10 per kilogram or potentially less. And this would enable us to move to the moon and build a permanent moon base and beyond to Mars. But anything that we can, or anything I would say past that is purely speculation. Oh, and that's all. Thank you.
Great, thanks.